Whoops. And action.
Good afternoon. It is December 1st, 2022, and we announce that because we record the colloquia for our members in case they miss these occasions. The colloquia are a very important part of the Plato Society. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Steve Brewer. I'm your president, and I'm very happy to make a couple of important announcements to all of you. We have distinguished guests today, and we have a remarkably distinguished series starting in January, when indeed we will be back in person at Skirball. The distinguished array of speakers was arranged by Dave Roloff and Lise Matthews. Our arrangements with the Skirball, which includes our familiar coffee and cookies before the event, the arrangements were made by Mark Farber and Ellen Haas, and we thank all of those people for the work they do. The colloquia is part of our offering at the Plato Society, and we will begin our next semester in January and welcome anybody who would like to join us and participate in both our SDGs, our study discussion groups, or our colloquia, or other activities which we have throughout the year. With my thanks, I'd like to turn it over to the chair of our colloquia committee, Dave Roloff. Thank you, Dave.
Afternoon. My name is Dave Roloff, and Ellen Haas and I are the co-chairs of the Colloquium Committee for the 2022-23 term. I am really happy to introduce the guests that we have today. The first is Bob Shrum, who is the director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future and the Carmen H. and Lewis Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics. He's a legendary political strategist. He was once described as the most sought after consultant in the Democratic Party. He was a speechwriter for George McGovern, Ted Kennedy. He's been a strategist for over 25 winning U.S. Senate campaigns, 8 successful campaigns for governor, additional successful campaigns for mayors in American cities, and numerous campaigns in Congress and statewide actions. His clients have included none other than Joe Biden, John Glenn, David Dinkins, Tom Bradley, and John Kerry and Al Gore in their presidential races. In 2005, he shifted his attention to the academic world. Professor Shrum teaches classes at USC on domestic policy, applied politics, and election. Shrum's book, No Excuse, Confessions of a Serial Campaigner, was a national bestseller. As a journalist, he has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, LA Times, Time, Newsweek, Huffington Post, Slate, The Week, and the Daily Beast. And also we have with us today Mike Murphy, who is the co-director of the Center for the Political Future at USC. He is one of the Republican Party's most successful political media consultants, having handled strategy and advertising for more than 26 successful gubernatorial and senatorial campaigns. His record in helping Republicans win Democratic seats is unmatched by any other GOP consultant. He has been called a media master by Fortune, GOP's hottest media consultant. He is a widely known political pundit, appearing frequently on NBC, CNN, NPR. He has served as a senior strategist for both the John McCain's first campaign for president in 2000 and Arnold Schwarzenegger's historic election as governor of California. He has worked on successful campaigns for many GOP governors and senators, including Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney, et cetera, et cetera. Murphy served as a chief strategist for the Right to Rise PAC, which supported Jeb Bush's candidacy. And in 2020, Murphy joined former aides to George W. Bush and John McCain to endorse Joe Biden for president. So I am happy to introduce the two of them and turn it over to them. Okay, guys.
Well, thank you. We're delighted to be here. And I guess I'll start off, Mike, with sort of my take on the midterms and what's happening, at least immediately afterwards, and turn it over to you. As Mike knows, I always thought that Democrats would keep the Senate and narrowly lose the House. The truth is, it's really narrow in the House. If you change 3,400 votes around the country, Democrats would control the House. And one thing I think it's worth noting is the nonpartisan polls were generally accurate. What happened was there were a lot of partisan polls that were dumped into the polling averages and led people, for example, to think that somehow or other Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire was going to have a hard race, when in fact she had, in the end, a very easy race. Same thing with Michael Bennet in Colorado. I think three factors contributed to what is a kind of historic success. You have to go back to 1962 to have a Democratic president have as good a midterm as Joe Biden did. Kennedy lost, like, I think 3 seats in the House, but he gained 3 or 4 seats in the Senate. And you have to go back to 1934 to find an incumbent president, Democratic president, who didn't lose a single state legislative chamber in the midterms. In fact, Democrats gained state legislative chambers. 3 factors, I think, were principally responsible for this. The Republicans thought this was going to be an election all about inflation, but I think some other things came into play and for example, motivated youth voters to vote overwhelmingly Democratic. One was the Dobbs decision, the overturning Roe v. Wade. The press generally thought, well, it's faded. It's not going to be a big deal. It was a very big deal. Number 2, the presence of Donald Trump and the threats to democracy. People derided Biden for giving that speech about the threats to democracy. And actually, in the exit polling, it turns out to be a big motivator for people. And number 3, as Mitch McConnell said, candidate quality. Republicans nominated several bags of bolts in different states, and they just couldn't win. I mean, there was no way, in my view, that a Don Bolduc was going to win in New Hampshire when he was talking about kids being made to use kitty litter boxes in schools. I just think people thought he was, and Mike's done a lot of work in New Hampshire, and so have I. People there are pretty sensible, and they don't fall for stuff like that. One of the fallouts of this, and it's not without historic precedent, is we're seeing a lame duck session of Congress where a lot's going to get done. I mean, the Respect for Marriage Act is going to pass. This reminds me of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell passing in the 2010 lame duck after the Democrats got shellacked in that election, as President Obama said. We're going to see a bill to prevent a railroad strike. I think we may see the Electoral College Reform Act. When we go into next year, and I'll let Mike speak to this, it seems to me that with a very narrow majority in the House, and without the kind of discipline Nancy Pelosi managed to exert on the Democratic caucus, it's gonna be a very fraught period. I mean, Kevin McCarthy still doesn't have the votes to be elected House Speaker, and the Freedom Caucus, so-called Freedom Caucus that he has to deal with, is demanding all sorts of concessions. If I, by the way, were, and this is how Democrats or Republicans hold the majority, if I were a Republican from some of these seats that voted for Biden, sometimes by pretty substantial margins, I would worry about a Congress that focused solely on investigations and demands to cut Social Security and Medicare, or else crash the debt limit. I don't think that would go over very well with voters. But anyway, that's kind of my global take on what went on. And now Mike can correct me.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to see you. It's good to join all of you at the Plato Society. I can already tell you're a lot more fun than the Aristotle League we were at last week. So They were difficult, but seriously, I'll give you my take on the midterms, which isn't that different than Bob's. Has a little less of that DNC spray paint to it, but I think Bob's fundamentally right. So the first thing about the midterms, they were amazingly historic. The norm, the historical norm, which has overwhelmingly been true since World War II, is that the president, the incumbent president in the first term, has a rough time in the midterms. Since World War II, on average, the president's party has lost 26 seats in the House. And then if you combine that with elections with high inflation, the losses are even worse. And then finally, you look at the favorability of the president going into the midterms, because the election is often, historically, almost always about the president. And Joe Biden's numbers were pretty mediocre. And then this election happened. And this is very atypical. Among the large number of voters who have a somewhat unfavorable opinion of Joe Biden, the Democrats actually won a majority of them. Never seen that before in a midterm in recent history. And so it was sort of fascinating. It takes a very big crowbar to pry the focus of a midterm election away from the president and the economy. It's almost unprecedented. The last time it happened was in 2002, the midterm for George W. Bush, where the Republicans picked up a few seats. And the crowbar there was Osama bin Laden. Huge, traumatic national event on 9/11. And Bush had high favorables, and he was able to pick up just a handful of seats. So this was really something. And the question is it a big anomaly? Or is it the future where things are much more untethered to the traditional issues like pocketbook stuff like the economy, which have ruled political history for most elections? And there's arguments either way. If anything, you can see the country is highly divided on a cultural issue. We're fighting tribally on those things rather than on the price of hot dogs or inflation or the price of gas. I agree with Bob that the two main factors driving it that made the election not about punishing Joe Biden, but about punishing Republicans, even though I will interject that it has been rare in midterms that the Republicans get a larger percentage of the national congressional vote than the Democrats. They did inch ahead by about 1/3 of a percentage point, it appears. So more people voted Republican for Congress than Democrat, but not by an overwhelming number, again, by about 1/3 of 1%. Anyway, the two issues that really did it were, one, Donald Trump and the squadron of unacceptable candidates that he helped engineer primaries for in governor and senatorial and a few congressional races. So as much as people were upset about the economy and upset at Joe Biden, the Republican alternative in many places was so horrific, they kind of held their nose and stuck with the Democrats. And that totally overturned the election from normalcy to what we had. The second big factor was overturning Roe v. Wade. The biggest problem the Democrats have in a midterm election is many of younger voters who support the Dems habitually don't vote in the off-year elections. Off-year elections have roughly, it varies, but roughly 1/3 less voter participation than a presidential. And the third who don't show up tend to be younger, more of color, et cetera, et cetera. We had a special election in the Hudson Valley a few months before the election in a true swing congressional seat, one of the rarest things, because redistricting has kind of eliminated the classic congressional swing seat. They're still around, but now there may be 30 of them. There used to be 90. I used to live here in California in a district that was only contiguous at low tide, that the old Waxman-Berman machine really creatively did, and the Republicans have done the same thing in other places. So in this swing district in the Hudson Valley, which was really a 50-50 race, the normal dynamic would be for the Republican candidate to probably win. Instead, the Democratic candidate won. It was kind of a early canary falling off the perch and thudding to the floor, warning that maybe this time would be different. And one of the biggest drivers, and it was narrow, but of that outcome was turnout in the college towns in the district was extremely, historically, atypically high. We see it at USC. We have an award-winning program there to register kids to vote. We rank among the top in over 100 universities nationally that do it. We put a lot of work into it. And our numbers have been off the chart. So there was definitely energy by younger pro-choice cohorts. One of the things the media misses is the most pro-choice voters in America are young men. They are more pro-choice than young women, or more allegiant to voting on abortion rights issues. So all those things came together, bit of a perfect storm. That said, the Democrats did lose control of the House, which means they lose control of the checkbook, but it was not the romping that both history and Republican insiders, I would say most neutral pundits, kind of expected. The expectations for the R's was lower in the Senate because of the low quality of the candidates. So there we are. Now, another thing Bob said, and I'll finish up with this and one other point, the House is extremely hard to operate with a 4-vote margin, 3, 4, 5, mostly because it's never running with a full body of participating members. There's always one or two people in the hospital or with legal trouble or who die suddenly. And, you know, the governors don't point to be a special election. So it's very rare everybody's there. So, you know, one special election, one indictment, and one bad illness and everything, the majority could be very shaky. It's just not designed to work that close. I wrote a TV show that I created last year for CBS, and the premise was a 3-vote House. And we thought we could get 100 episodes out of all the skullduggery that'll go on. And of course, both parties are split into factions. The Republicans have a particularly militant faction on the right. The Democrats have a smaller but rather militant faction on the left. So the coalition politics of the House are going to be difficult. The thing to count on is, one, Republicans take over the checkbook, and Republicans now have the power to investigate, which they will get, in my view, a bit drunk on. The power to investigate can be politically very powerful if you use it sparingly. So when you do it, it means something, rather than investigate everything from Joe Biden's socks yesterday to 1,000 other things. So we'll see if they're shrewd about it or not. In the past, at least the recent past, they haven't been. Finally, there's a lesson for Democrats here, which is don't be cocky. It's a mistake to think this election was a big embrace of Joe Biden. It was rejection of Trump republicanism. And that has damaged Donald Trump. We're going to talk about this in the party, and politics always being dynamic, will move and evolve. Democrats still have a lot of work to do looking at the reelect, though from Biden's point of view, it's great news, because if he'd been wiped out in the normal way, they'd be calling for his head within the party now, and he'd be in a tough situation. Now he has bragging rights. His whispering critics have settled down, and his ability to plausibly plot a re-election is in much better shape than it could have been had this been a normal rejection of the incumbent.
Mike, are you as impressed by what's happened in the lame duck and what's happening in the lame duck session as I am?
Yeah, I'm a fanatic for the Electoral College Reform Act, which has the most boring name in the history of politics, but it's one of the most important pieces of legislation because it patches all the 1874 holes in how we count the electoral college. You know, if you bring 3 mules, you get an extra vote. I mean, it is so antiquated and so gray in its regulation. It's kind of based on honor. So it's open to be attacked by polarizing, dishonorable people, of which we can probably all name a few. And there's a bipartisan effort, McConnell and Schumer, on it to patch a lot of problems there to kind of tighten it up for the next presidential. And it looks very good for passing. Of course, the gay marriage legislation, which had pretty strong Republican support, 12 members led by Mitt Romney and a few others. I think that was a powerful accomplishment. So yeah, there's a little bit of actual legislating breaking out, and the polar wings don't like it a lot, but I think the country will welcome it, and maybe that'll incentivize a bit more.
Yeah, I want to go to what you said about the Republican House. First of all, I assume that McCarthy will get elected speaker, but it's clear that it's a perils of Pauline situation.
Yeah, not. I think better chance than yes, but I wouldn't call it 3-1. You know, I wouldn't. Yeah. I think it's like a 60-40 deal. What he's probably going to do is try to make a deal to rig some Freedom Caucus members as committee and subcommittee chairman in exchange for their support. But you're right, it's dicey.
Yeah, and where that takes me is, you know, when you put some of those Freedom Caucus people into those committees, I think you might have an orgy of investigations. And we know from what went on in the 1990s, for example, with the impeachment of Bill Clinton, that which was followed in 1998 by another anomalous midterm election, where Democrats did very well and when they shouldn't have. I think the country will rebel against this. Republicans ran saying they were going to deal with inflation. And the two things that have come out so far is that they're going to investigate. I'm not sure, by the way, that the country is going to think it was such a bad thing for Joe Biden to try to help his kid when he was in trouble. And secondly, and I referred to this earlier, there are people in the Freedom Caucus who, and I know that McConnell does not want this under any circumstances. And there are a few senators like Rick Scott who want to hold the debt limit hostage, which would crash the full faith and credit of the United States, and maybe shut down the government to try to force through changes in Social Security and Medicare. Why is that a good idea politically?
Well, it's not. They're not going to do it. It's one wing of the party trying to play to the Republican primary voter base. But let me back up to the first thing you said. Too many investigations make investigations irrelevant. If the R's were smart, they'd do a January 6th type investigation on the massive spending under Biden. And we're going to find hundreds of millions of mistakes and fraud and checks that were never cut. It's very vulnerable to a fair-minded investigation. The problem is instead they're going to go after Joe Biden's Netflix account, Hunter Biden. And even though there might be some stuff there, I agree with you. People expect so little of politicians now. There's no shocker that Joe Biden has the equivalent of a Don Nixon burger or Billy Carter thing going on. And I don't think that's a big deadly weapon. And I think it devalues the real investigations. We have a massive scandal here in California with COVID funds that could be brought to light. So I think they are going to bundle that. There are some people, and this is such a gift. I hear you back in your old campaign mode on this, that the Republicans are going to hold their breath until we cut Social Security. That's a political suicide note. And McConnell and even Kevin, if Kevin is speaker, and if Kevin is speaker with enough power to follow or lead his caucus rather than be imprisoned by a big open question, won't fall for that trap. The debt limit thing is a lesser version of it, but it's a scary monster. The Dems are great, as we found out before, at kind of making it about the peril of a meltdown. And the Republicans are great at being irresponsible and scaring Wall Street with it. Again, I think cooler heads are trying to prevail, but I would not be surprised if there's some brinkmanship on that. Part of the problem is the Democrats want to make one deal forever, and the smarter Republicans want to punt. And the hardcore Republicans want to have an apocalyptic showdown, which is, of course, a political error of suicidal proportions. And we'll see how.
Yeah. So I think
it'll be under control. I don't know about the House.
I want to go back to something you referred to briefly early on and talk about the implications of all this for 2024. In the Democratic Party, it's pretty clear to me right now that if Joe Biden wants to run and he's healthy and the economy is in fairly decent shape, he's going to be the nominee. The only person who's talking about challenging him is Nina Turner, for heaven's sake, who lost a congressional primary in Ohio and then ran again and lost the congressional primary a second time. I think she'd get 0.02% of the vote in New Hampshire. So I think the field is pretty clear for Biden at this point. You have people like Newsom saying, look, put me in coach, I'm with you, I'm not going to run. And I guess we could talk about who would run if he didn't. But what's happened is there's been a kind of reversal of assumptions. The assumptions were before the midterms that Biden was in trouble and was going to get challenged. And at least among a lot of people, that Trump was going to romp to the Republican nomination. I think the midterms have left Trump in a much weakened position. I think Republicans are afraid to run with him. They don't want to do it. There's a really interesting poll out today from Marquette University in Wisconsin, which, as you know, is the gold standard of polling in that state, which shows Biden beating Trump by 10 points and tied with Ron DeSantis.
Yeah. Yep.
Biden has now, Trump has become a drag on the Republican Party. But how much of a spent force is he? Does he somehow or other, because Republicans have all these winner-take-all primaries, take his solid 30, 35% and capture the Republican nomination without ever commanding a majority of Republican voters?
Well, let me back up and do the Democrats first, and then I'll wind around to Trump, because I disagree slightly with you on that. If Biden had had bad midterms and lost the Senate, I think Gavin Newsom and others would be having different talking points about we have to have a party conversation. The digital and cable media would go crazy with it. So I think Joe had a narrow escape there, but he had an escape. So now that's all tamped down. My guess is he wants to run for re-election. All presidents do. The Democratic Party historically kind of likes primaries, but they almost always lose. I mean, you look back, Fritz Mondale was kind of, as vice president, was the front runner, not an incumbent, but, he had to beat Gary Hartback. Ted Kennedy took on Jimmy Carter. Ted Kennedy, a powerful figure, as you well know. We were there in the party, got beat back by Jimmy Carter. So presidents in trouble tend to get a primary challenge. But to your bigger point, the primary people tend to lose. The incumbent presidency is a powerful thing. Same thing with Ford versus Reagan on the Democratic side. So, Republican side in 76. So since Biden missed the chopping block, he can build up some steam now. And if he wants to announce he's going to run, if he chooses to, probably by April, he's got a clear runway to do that. And I think he'd be a huge favorite for the nomination. He does have one problem, which is age. The Biden sounds his age. So the age thing is an issue. Now, maybe he can handle it, but having age be an issue is kind of like waking up one day as president and notice you have 4-foot antlers coming out of your head. Every press conference, everything, hey, I cured cancer. Yeah, but what about those antlers? What the hell's going on there? So it's a hard thing to work around unless you can make it somehow into an asset. Yeah, he's old, but old is good. Or yeah, he's sharp. Or boy, look what he just did. He exceeded expectations. One problem I think he's going to have on this, and I doubt it'll mean a Democratic primary, but I think it's a thing, which means who the Republicans nominate becomes even more important, is all presidents wind up spending the night or two in Walter Reed, heart murmur, indigestion, they need to get an appendectomy. The media is going to go unfairly crazy about Joe Biden it'll be death watch, and they're going to be irresponsible. So how they work around the age thing is important. What they got to pray for is Trump, because then you got another old guy, and it's a repeat of the last thing and Trump this time will be weaker. So to your main question, what's going on in the Republican Party? Trump is seen by the media and many political observers as Rasputin. He can't be killed. But the truth is, of course he can.
And Rasputin was killed.
I was going to say, they eventually got him. Here's the hint: use a gun, not poison. So right now, there's been a huge change in the inside leadership class of the party, which is we got to get rid of this guy. In the primary voter arena, it's a little murkier, but it's not good. That Wisconsin poll is an example. That's general election voters, but you've got weak Republican numbers driving that. There was a great poll by Trump's own pollster, who's probably locked in the cellar now with the secret documents at Mar-a-Lago, Tony Fabrizio, who about 9-10 months ago did a poll among Republicans only. What's your opinion of Trump? And it was like 87% favorable. Oh, he's great. Should he run again and be our nominee? It drops to 45%. So there is room for something new, the best word in advertising. And right now, Ron DeSantis has that space. In Florida, among voters, a big Republican, a good reflection of Republican mindset. One of the few states this year that was a Republican paradise and was knocking down Democrats like bowling pins. DeSantis beats Trump. Among people who know both products, who've had both hamburgers, the DeSantis hamburger is winning. Now, running for president is like going through a car wash 5,000 times, and DeSantis has been through twice. So we got to wait and see. But there's tremendous interest. The large dollar donors have left Trump. They're very interested in others, particularly DeSantis. Pence has some grip in the party, and there are others coming up. Last thing I'd say is I want to address your question about the winner take all, because it's a really important point. The Democrats all cried when old Yeller died, God bless them. So they have a proportional delegate system in the primaries. You come in fourth, oh, but you had that great song with the guitar, you get one delegate. The Republicans are mean social Darwinists. If you lose by 5 votes, who cares, loser? Winner take all, you get no delegates, hit the road. And so that is an advantage in a plurality early for somebody like Trump, who can take 38% of the vote and, you know, basically get at such an early delegate lead after a couple of contests that by the time it winnows down to one non-Trump challenger, there are very few delegates left and it becomes mathematically impossible to catch up. There's a lot of secret talk going on in the Republican Party now about switching to a proportional system because everybody but Trump benefits from that. The Republican rules allow proportional, but not till after March. One vote at the RNC, meeting coming up in late February, can move that forward. And that way, Trump will not get early delegates should he run in the end. And the thing could coalesce to a stop Trump candidate and would go on forever like the Democratic thing does, which is on one hand a headache, on the other hand a great proving field. So we got more drama coming. Trump is nowhere near what he used to be, but he in the party, a dictator almost, but he's still a powerful force. And the difference is this time there's going to be a real fight, not a coronation like the re-elect nomination was.
Dave, should we go to questions? You're muted.
You're
Dave.
muted.
The answer is yes, as soon as I unmute myself. Okay, let me see what we got here. Okay, on a panel show, do the panelists get briefed on the questions in advance? So when you guys are on the tube, are you pre-fed?
Mike and I used to do a lot of Meet the Press with Tim Russer. He never told us what the questions were going to be in advance.
Yeah, you get a little tip on topics. We're going to do the economy, the Senate races, the president's trip to Zimbabwe or whatever. Crossfire, which I did about 150 times way back, they're a little more like pro wrestling. You know, they're in your ear during the show. Ask him about his stupid wife getting arrested for DUI. They were a little more in showbiz. Remember, that show started after dinner in Washington. So the host had all had a couple, and it was a different thing. But the serious shows, the Sundays, no, it's not pre-scripted, though general topic areas are known.
And the truth is, if you know the host or the hosts in the case of Crossfire, you have a pretty good sense of what they're going to ask. You can, with Tim, you always knew that somehow or other you were going to get to entitlements. That was going to be on the agenda. But serious shows just don't do that. They might say, I want you to talk about the Democratic primary race, but that's the most hint you get.
They would give you a packet of newspaper headlines of the biggest national stories and know you're kind of in that orbit. Now, great Tim story. When Tim had somebody running for president or a big leader of either party on the show, on Monday and Tuesday, if he had a Democratic candidate, he'd call all the Republican leading consultants and say, what are the 3 toughest questions I could ask? And you put your staff on it. So Tim now had 100 people working for him, digging up stuff. And then he'd filter it through his own researches to make sure it's legit. And he'd only call people he trusted to be adults and give them real stuff. And then when the Republicans on, he'd do it with all the Democrats. So Tim had the whole town working for him to get those good prosecutorial questions, which I always thought was a pretty clever system for him.
Okay, how did Herschel Walker escape the crazy Trump nominee curse?
Well, we don't know yet. We have a runoff coming.
He hasn't yet. He finished second in the initial voting. The runoff system is a remnant of Jim Crow. It was originally designed to make sure that an African-American couldn't get elected with a plurality of the vote.
Designed by the Democrats back then. I can't resist.
Listen, I'm not assigning any partisan motive to it. I mean, that all began to change in the 60s, obviously. But I think that, and I turned out to be right about Biden in in 2020, and I turned out to be right about the midterms. So I ought to shut up and not predict things. But I suspect that Herschel Walker will prove to be a large bag of cement at the end of the day, and probably will not win this runoff election. I don't know what Mike's view of that is. The early voting.
I mean, I did the last Georgia runoff years ago for Paul Coverdale, and we won. And the old rules of a runoff is the turnout drops because, it's just like yet another election. So under that, Herschel would have a shot. The best poll that's out, and polls can be overrated in horse race predicting. They're really more useful to get inside the voter's head to know how to run a campaign to move said voter. But the best poll is done by a combination of Joe Biden's pollster and Donald Trump's. And they've got Warnock up about 4. And so if it's the same electorate that showed up, the odds are pretty strong that Herschel Walker will lose. The race doesn't have quite the import now. So if you're a Republican suburbanite and you're like, oh, I just don't want the liberals to run the Senate, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for Herschel and pray for survival. That argument, that excuse, that permission structure is gone now because the Dems have it. Now, on the other hand, it's extremely important to the Democrat functioning of the Senate that they win. Because just like the House, there's an old famous thing, you remember, where Pete Wilson, when he was senator from California, was wheeled in by Bob Dole on a stretcher from the hospital because they needed his vote. And in a 50-50 Senate, the committees are all 50-50 and it's all jammed up. The Dems can get the 51, particularly on the Judiciary Committee. They can run judges through like Lucy and the Pie Factory. So the Republicans really would rather win it, but out in voter world, it's not seen as important. In that polling I mentioned, Warnock is strong because he just destroys Herschel Walker among voters under 35. If they don't show up, and they tend to be the most fickle voters, then it'll be a long election night with a possibility for an upset. But everything we know from the surge in mail-in voting now for the runoff next week gives comfort to Warnock. So if I had to bet, and I'm kind of with Bob, not a great prediction to make, but if I had to bet, I would bet on Warnock. But it's not impossible. Yet again, in this screwball election, we have a surprise in Georgia.
So it sounds like, after 2016 and 2020, pollsters, I wasn't trusting many pollsters after 16 and 20. It sounds like you guys are back on the pollster bandwagon. How have things changed to where we feel more comfortable with them?
Bob, do you want to start, and then I'll do my therapy?
Sure. Well, first of all, there's a very interesting article that came out this morning that in all of the Senate races, the nonpartisan polling accurately predicted the winner. What happened was there were partisan polls that, as I said earlier, flooded into the averages. And so the 538 average, the Real Clear Politics average, made the races look very different than they turned out. So that's number one. Number two, at the presidential level, and this obviously doesn't apply to these Senate races and congressional races, we experimented at USC with the USC poll that we do with the Center for Economic and Social Research with an alternative question. Not who are you going to vote for? Because we were off on that, just like everybody else in 2020. The question that worked was, who are your friends and neighbors going to vote for? And that was right on the money. So I think you'll see some changes in the way the presidential polling is done going forward. But the polling averages were wrong. The nonpartisan pollsters, they didn't get the margins right necessarily, but they got the winners right.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm obsessed with this, but I'm going to limit myself to 2 points. One is campaigns don't use polling for what interested observers use it for. People like polling who care about the election, Democrat, Republican, whoever you're rooting for, you want to know the future. You want to know if Herschel Walker is going to be in the Senate or not. You're either excited about it or horrified by it. So you look at the polls every day. Herschel Walker down 5. Oh, thank God. Herschel Walker up 6. I'm moving to Portugal. So that's really not what polls are good at, particularly a few months out. They don't predict well. We don't use them for that. We use them to take the voters' heads apart and see what new information we can inject into the electorate to move the voter in our direction. Because we spend tens of millions of dollars on that to try to target that well. We know the predictive power polling doesn't really work till the very end. And so we don't care that much that the poll was, quote, wrong. We're more interested in what it told us about the voters to go push them and see where they land, because voters can change their mind. The other problem with polling science is great. It is accurate. You can talk to 800 people and know exactly what's going on. The problem is how to talk to 800 people randomly that represent the voters in a world where nobody has a home phone and nobody wants to be on the cell phone for 20 minutes. Sampling is much harder. The average pollster has to make nearly 200 phone calls to get one 20-minute complete. And so there's a lot more modeling inside. The other thing is when you weight a poll, the smartest thing to do is weight it to history. You poll the electorate that showed up last time. But once in a while, different people show up. Trump brought in some people that made polling wrong. This year, some of those young voters that hadn't seen a mid-year election showed up. And the pollsters, you can't weight the poll to what you hope happens. You weight it to what happened last time, because it's still most likely it'll repeat, which is why if you watch the network news coverage on election night, you can see little hints. In the polling of the electorate that was the normal electorate to show up in a midterm, abortion was a distant third issue. When they started teasing the exits on NBC where I work or CNN or whatever, there's like abortion is number 2, tied for 2. Well, that's code for a hell of a lot of young abortion voters showed up that the polling didn't catch. So, you know, the thing to do is assume your side is 2 points down and act accordingly. Because watching the polls for your own kind of therapy animal observer mental health would drive you crazy. And Bob's right, they put junk polls in the system to screw these people who say it's the average that counts. No, it's not. You know, you can have 3 gourmet meals and 14 dishes of slop. It doesn't make the pile of food better.
And I think that Republicans actually hurt themselves with these junk polls because they believed the averages. They believed the red wave or the red tsunami was coming. And they didn't do what Mike is talking about, which is take the data and figure out how you can make arguments that might actually move some people. You know, the exception to that might be Wisconsin, where the Democrats nominated someone from the very progressive wing of the party. I hate to use that phrase because Joe Biden's a progressive. I think I'm a progressive. I haven't moved. It's just there are some other people that are pretty far to the left of me. And the Ron Johnson, who should have been the most vulnerable Republican incumbent running for re-election, was able to use his polling data to find the attacks that would prevent Mandela Barnes from winning. Now, it was a 1-point race, but it was a very, very effective use of polling. For the most part, I don't think
that went to the crime issue primarily.
Pardon?
That turned on the crime issue primarily?
Yeah, crime was the biggest, but they had a couple. I mean, if Dave McCormick had won the primary against the Trump candidate Oz in Pennsylvania, I think Fetterman would have had a much tougher race. So, you know, who you nominate counts. And finally, the Dems are in the junk polling business too. I mean, my advice is don't read polls about issues and what people are thinking. Don't trust the horse race to regulate your political mental health.
Okay, here's another one. So with all the talent in Hollywood and New York City, why can't the Dems come up with short, powerful slogans to use in their elections? So, Mike, why are you so good at your job and the other side isn't?
Well, you know, Bob and I have both been at this a long time, and we all have funny stories about, in a presidential election particularly, regular people get excited. And there's always a delegation from Hollywood that shows up and says, we're here to fix all the communications. Or I was in one thing with some of the best people on Madison Avenue, and they came in with storyboards, and the brilliant ad man from Madison Avenue, it was the Bush reelect, a guy named Martin Purvis, who came up with the ultimate driving machine, tightest ship in the shipping business, a brilliant copywriter, Hall of Famer. Bob and I, friends of both. I sat there with them, and these guys were bringing in, and Martin was doing clever whispers in my ear. One guy had a 60-second spot. It's floors or Georgia oak. Pittsburgh steel holds the roof intact through storms. The glass is made, and they worked in every 50 states into the White House. So it's a different kind of creativity. We're fundamentally strategists who know how to use media, and some of us have a creative knack for advertising. It's a different thing. And the Hollywood people are even worse. No offense, I'm a Hollywood person. I belong to 2 unions. I've sold a bunch of pilot scripts and movies and stuff. But they come in and they have a point of view from entertainment. But remember, a blockbuster in entertainment if you get 12% of the people excited. Right now, getting 2% of the country to watch a primetime show is a hit. And we're in the 50% business. It's a different world. So they come in, they tell everybody they're an idiot, they get shut out, and they get angry about it. Hollywood is basically like the oil business in Texas. It's a place where politicians come to milk the cow for desperately needed money, which is a perfectly good function for folks to provide.
Yeah, and I actually disagree with the premise of the question. I think that Barack Obama, for example, Hope and Change was a very powerful appeal to people. Sometimes Democrats have done better at this. Sometimes Republicans have done better. In 2016, if you look at the 2 top line slogans, I mean, Trump, Make America Great Again, and the real problems are immigration and trade. And that's why all of you folks in the Rust Belt have hollowed out lives, and I'm going to fix it, was a lot more powerful than Stronger Together, which was Hillary's slogan, which actually wasn't a positive slogan about her. It was a negative hit on Trump. And she never gave people a positive sense of what she would do about those who had been left out and left behind as the economy improved after the 2008 financial crisis. But Democrats are, I'm stealing this from Mike, Democrats are the neurotic party. I mean, they always think that somehow or other, they're not doing it right and the other side is doing it right. I actually think sometimes Democrats do it right and sometimes Republicans do it right.
Yeah.
I also, like Mike, I only belong to one Hollywood union. I do have a Writers Guild award and some other stuff like that. But people have tried this year after year after year in both parties. And by the way, Martin Puris is now, thanks to Donald Trump, a Democrat. But people have tried this and it almost never works out. I think Martin was actually pretty good at it and could contribute in a substantial way. But I mean, I recall one presidential campaign where, and this was back when candidates took federal funding, which I was always against once you had the internet because you could raise a lot of money. And they had a pretty good ad, pretty good idea for an ad. It would have cost about $1 million to produce. And when your whole budget at that time was like $80 million, you weren't going to spend $1 million producing an ad. So I think that there are some very good people in both parties who do this advertising, make the media. Sometimes one candidate or another has a better slogan, a better understanding of where the voters are, or better targeting, which is what Trump did. He lost the popular vote, but he targeted the vote he needed to win.
I'll just add in defense of Madison Avenue, there are outliers. Tom Mesner, a mentor of mine, was great. Hal Riney, famous on the Republican side. There's a guy named Bob Gardner, Y&R guy out of San Francisco. There have been some, because what happens is they're kind of humble about it and they learn that political marketing is different. And once they understand, oh, we're doing dentistry here, they apply their creative skills and their pragmatic point of view and really can add a lot. And finally, the Mad Ave people, though they always think this is a demotion, they're better at the graphic design stuff, bringing in the really good iconic Jack Frost in the Republican Party. I'm blanking on the name, but the Obama Hope and Change logo. And in a presidential campaign, that logo stuff is important. And they're always far better at it than the political people are.
Okay, I want to turn to the midterm state legislature results. Were they consistent with the U.S. House and U.S. Senate results, or even more unexpectedly blue?
I think they were more unexpectedly blue. Michigan, the Democrats, Mike's state, home state, Democrats control both houses of the legislature for the first time, Mike, since I think 1984.
No, it's bigger than that. So as an old Michigan guy, I used to all Engler's campaigns, our 3-term governor, a couple of senators. They took the state Senate, which was like Republican Central, the base, for the first time since 1983. And Gretchen Whitmer, the governor there, is going to be a rising star. Keep an eye on her.
In Pennsylvania, the same thing. I mean, Republicans had a very dominant position in the state legislatures. They don't now. As I said, you have to go back to 1934 to have an incumbent president in his first midterm do as well at the state legislative level as the Democrats did this year.
Though again, I flagged the play a little. This was more punish the kooks than we love the Democrats.
Well, I'm not assigning a reason for it, but I as I said earlier, I think Donald Trump was a big part of the reason the Democrats did so much better than folks expected, or at least most folks expected. This election was not a referendum on Joe Biden. It was much more a referendum on Donald Trump.
And that's such an oddity to happen, but Trump has this supernatural power to make it about him. That's why I keep saying the Democratic National Committee should rename its headquarters to Trump Center, because, you know, if it had been a referendum on Biden, it would have been a more normal outcome.
So do Democrats want Trump to be the nominee?
I don't.
Yeah, I'm with Bob. Patriotic Democrats don't, because you're playing with radiation there. But cynical Democrats who just want the easiest opponent want Trump. But, you know, careful. It's kind of like nerve gas. Boy, it sure worked in the first battle, but now we have nerve gas around, you know, and then, oh, we have an atomic bomb. We just used it. Okay, now we live in an atomic fear age. So the best thing is for Trump to go away.
Yeah. In my view, Trump is anthrax for our democracy.
Yeah.
I think he probably is the easiest Republican for a Democratic presidential nominee to defeat, but I don't want to take the risk that he would win. And with the consequent, I think, dismemberment of a lot of what makes this democracy what it is and has been for a long time. You know, remember 2016, Hillary didn't have a concession speech ready. They had thousands of people in the Javits Center, I think, in New York, ready to have this giant celebration. Donald Trump thought he was going to lose, and he won. So I don't want to take that risk. Yeah,
and you know, from the Republican long-term point of view, don't underestimate the Democrats' ability to screw up too. And then all of a sudden you got a, you know, bad scenario. They've run candidates Trump can beat before. And if Biden doesn't run, and I think health reasons may force him not to, and I think he's enough of a patriot to make a country first decision a year from now or 6 months from now. Who knows who the Democratic nominee will be? There's a lot of talk about changing their calendar, and that can have an effect on the outcome.
Yeah, let's talk about if Biden is out, say because of health issues. Let's look at the field and handicap him a little bit. Particularly, I mean, how do Democrats turn on Kamala Harris? I mean, aren't you going to go at the African American and female constituency if you go another way?
Well, maybe they don't. Whether they should or not, maybe they don't. You know, I think South Carolina will continue to play a huge role in the Democratic primary process. Jim Clyburn has indicated pretty strongly that if Biden were not running, he would be for Kamala Harris. So maybe it doesn't happen. I think if Biden decides not to run, Newsom will take a very serious look at this, which would be interesting because he and Harris actually were kind of partners as they moved up the political food chain in California. You've got Pete Buttigieg. Mike mentioned Gretchen Whitmer. I think Amy Klobuchar would like to take another run at this. You know, the new governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, is one of the most interesting people in the Democratic Party. He's African American. That might make it easier to go against Kamala Harris. But, you know, one of the reasons that I think a lot of Democrats had a sigh of relief after the midterms was, especially in the professional class, was they're not sure that, and Mike just alluded to this, they're not sure Democrats would get to the right nominee if Biden wasn't running.
Yeah, no, I'm with Bob on this. So the first thing you got to look at is the calendar. The view in the Democratic Party is that Iowa and New Hampshire are too Caucasian. They're not diverse enough. And the argument is made that African Americans are the core base of the party. So why don't any get to vote in the meaningful primary contest? Because they really don't till you get to South Carolina and beyond. So there's going to be a big fight at the DNC in the first quarter here to look at that calendar. And there's talk about moving various states up. Michigan was one of them, good diverse state. If I'm Gretchen Whitmer, I don't want to move it up because then the Michigan win means nothing for me. And if I win it, I don't win it big enough. There's talk of Minnesota moving up, even though people think of that as a lily white state. It's actually a bit more diverse now. Some people are interested in Georgia. So basically, if an African-American heavy primary electorate state gets moved up, that's wonderful news for Kamala Harris, who's struggling right now. In my view, weak candidate. The Republicans would love to run a presidential race against her. She's got what I call the California-Massachusetts disease, which is to be successful in California or Massachusetts, and there are other states like this, politics, the state is so blue that if you're good at rounding up the progressives in the San Francisco Bay Area and the public employee unions, and you play the inside Democratic game right, you win the Democratic primary, and then it's over. There is no Republican opposition. So you learn nothing useful to go win a Michigan or a Wisconsin or even a Georgia. Dukakis had that problem. Kamala Harris has that problem. So the question is, who could be, if the primary is more diverse early, who's an African-American potential opponent with weight to her? And the party will be looking for it. Cory Booker could run again. There are other names. There's also going to be, the Democrats win when they run the kind of candidate they don't initially embrace, which is a Southern white Protestant. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, because then they're playing on the Republican half of the football team. But in the primary they have now, that's harder and harder to do. So look, on a political science point of view, it would be kind of good if Trump and Biden don't run, because then the primary process for president is a great x-ray into what the primary really is, what the parties really are, what they want, what they become now, because they're always evolving. And we discover that because there'd be hellscape fights in both parties, but that's not always a bad thing. Is that likely they both don't run? No, but watch that calendar change and keep an eye on the Republican delegate changes. But there's no shortage of, and there's some interesting Republican candidates. We all talk about DeSantis, but there's Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina. I mean, there are a million of them. There are a couple of senators who are looking at it. There's Governor Larry Hogan, who's fantastic. I think he'd have a tough time in the primary. Governor Sununu, New Hampshire, is another moderate vote getter, but pretty hard to run from New Hampshire, just like hard to run from Michigan if they're early, because all your people say you're screwing up the franchise. Anyway, it's going to be a big, fascinating thing, and we're going to learn a lot about where the parties really are once they have multiple choices to make.
Yeah, I think Democrats will probably get rid of Iowa because it was so screwed up the last two times. And the last time was ridiculous. We didn't know who'd won it for a week. And that was not because of mail-in ballots. It's a caucus system. They just didn't know how to count the votes. And the reason they'll get rid of Iowa is because they kind of given up on it. Iowa's become a redder and redder and redder state. I'm skeptical that they're going to get rid of New Hampshire or try to get rid of New Hampshire.
Good luck.
Because in the close elections that we have, New Hampshire can actually make the difference. In 2000, I was in favor of giving up on Tennessee. Al Gore was not going to win Tennessee, home state or no home state. Take that money, and once again, we were under federal funding, put it in Boston, on Boston television and on Manchester television, and win New Hampshire. Instead, we lost New Hampshire very narrowly. Had he won New Hampshire, Florida wouldn't have mattered. So I think throwing away New Hampshire is probably not a good idea. We'll see whether or not they do it. The one other state that I think might make sense to put in there very early, it's early now, but to make it, right after New Hampshire would be Nevada. It's a diverse state.
Yeah.
And it doesn't cost an arm and a leg to compete there. I mean, the problem if you start in Michigan, aside from the one Mike alluded to with Gretchen Whitmer, it costs a fortune. Minnesota costs a fortune. Georgia costs a fortune. So if you begin in those states, you kind of winnow the field and you make it very hard for somebody who isn't either self-funded or seen by big contributors as a likely nominee to compete.
And if you're Biden and you are running, so there's no open, you really want to push Michigan forward, because Michigan, Wisconsin, that axis, plus Georgia, plus Nevada, maybe demographically Arizona down the road, New Hampshire, is pretty much the states that control the outcome in the end now. So, you want a big early Michigan statement while the Republicans go south and are playing to the right. So if Biden runs, I'll bet Michigan would be the best outcome for him. And what Whitmer thinks now may not count, because the president's running, the president will get from the DNC what he wants, most likely.
Okay, with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post having both turned on Trump, when will Fox News turn on him, or will they?
Well, he's good box office, so they don't totally turn, but it's starting. They won't be against him, but they're going to find other people to make famous. Which is,
who do they want to make famous? DeSantis?
Well, DeSantis right now, but again, he's got a couple hundred car washes to go through. They're going to love Tim Scott. I mean, you can kind of go down the list, and there's no reason. Remember, clicks and dollars. The better the show they put on, the better they do. So they're going to pick a couple and ringmaster it, I think. And Rupert is not a hands-off guy. He'll have a point of view. So it's business suicide for them to completely abandon Trump. But Trump isn't what Trump used to be. Trump in the Hollywood, not sure Trump can open a movie anymore. So that's what we're going to find out. And they're going to be watching that tighter than anybody.
Do you think that the media across the board is going to deal with Trump in a fundamentally different way than they have in the past? I mean, every time he sneezed or insulted somebody, it was a major headline. Is that going to continue?
To some extent, not the way he got $5.6 billion worth of free television time in 2016. That's not going to happen this time. People cut away from his announcement. I mean, it used to be that CNN and MSNBC, whatever the ideological character of those entities, would really focus on Trump rallies, because who knew what he was going to say? Now, I think what they'll do is if he says something outrageous, it'll be on the news, but they're not going to broadcast the whole thing. And we've already seen that effect beginning.
One thing you can definitely say about Trump is that he's brought people to vote who hadn't voted recently or at all. So why isn't the Republican Party now wedded to that deep group of Republicans?
Well, Trump's a proven loser. We've now had 3 general elections, 18, 20, and now 22, where he's slaughtered the Republican Party. In years they should do well, particularly this year. This year, the Golden Fleece was sitting there just to be picked up, and Trump came in and shat all over everything and screwed it up. So the idea that, there's this phony idea that Trump landed from Jupiter. That part might be true. And 100 million new voters appeared that we've never seen before. No, they're Republican primary voters. He did move some non-college educated white men and women off the Democrats. That did change. Republican Party, but conversely, the price of that trade, as one of my UAW relatives in Detroit will say, yeah, all I know is the Democrats never nominate anybody who knows how to change a tire. That's not the party I grew up with. This Trump guy's talking sense on all the jobs going to Mexico. He lost the college-educated white suburban Republicans. And net, it's been better for the Democrats. They keep slaughtering us. So the question is, what is Trump's grip in the primaries? And I told you about before the wipeout election, before the leadership class of the Republican Party started pulling away from him, he was down 80% favorable, 45% you should run. He had a problem to begin with. Now it's worse. The question is, will Trump be able to say, look what these fancy Mitch McConnell party leaders are doing, trying to kill me. You hate them, it's Washington, it's us and me and you against them. Can he get the grassroots angry at the leadership? But he won the nomination not with 50% of the primary vote. He had a plurality and he had winner take all. He did it in the high 30s. So, it's and he doesn't have the money now so this is Republican criminology, but if you ever go online, there's a big company that'll sell you just about anything. They're kind of like Granger, called Uline, or I'm blanking on the name. It's a family. They're arch conservatives. They fund a lot of this stuff I have a feeling this audience is probably a little more LA than Dallas. So a lot of the candidates you don't like, they write huge checks to, the Ulines.
Ulines, yes.
Yeah, Ulings. Richard,
Wisconsin.
Yeah, they were on a plane to go see Ron DeSantis a week ago. That is, and there's a lot of that going on. So the point is, Trump won't have the same oxygen. He'll have some of the same skills. Maybe now with Elon, he will have Twitter again. Doesn't have quite the same media grip, the live broadcast of his ice capade stuff that Bob talked about being covered live. And with the Republican cynics, the regulars who support him but secretly hate him, but they think it's pragmatic to support him for themselves, what they say is, what happened to the good Trump that could win an election when he talked about gas prices and the issues people care about? Now all he does is babble on and dribble about having the election stolen. He's off his game. He's old and crazy now. So there's no percentage in being for him anymore. He's a slow horse. Shoot him, get a new horse. And they're not as afraid of him anymore. You can see it on this horrible Mar-a-Lago anti-Semite Bund rally thing he did. Everybody was quiet for 48 hours. Then they started popping up, and now they're all popping up. Now, shame on them for not popping up instantly. And God bless my old client, Mitt Romney, yet again for leading the courage parade. But now it's spreading through all of them. So he's just, Rasputin now has two knives in him, and somebody's running in the room with a gun. And, that we're going to find he may not be as invincible. The media loves to look backwards and he's got all the grassroots. Well, prove it. Let's find out. Polls say he doesn't.
The movement of white working class, blue collar folks to Republicans is actually predates Trump.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, in 2020, Biden cut the margin by which Trump won those groups, or that group, from what had happened with Hillary. And John Fetterman in Pennsylvania went everywhere in the state, not thinking that he was going to win, for example, the Southwest, the far west of the state, the far south of the state on the West Virginia border, but believing he could cut the margins. Right. And he did. And so I would not assume that somehow or other Trump has created a stable new voter base for the Republican Party.
The only rule of politics is it's always changing. The question is the speed of change, which varies.
If Trump is indicted, what impact does that have on the?
Well, first of all, he could still be elected. He could be indicted and convicted and elected, because the only qualifications for becoming president are spelled out in the Constitution. There is a theory that if he got convicted for leading an insurrection under the one provision of the 14th Amendment, he'd be ineligible to run for office. I don't know that the courts would actually go that far. I think if he's indicted, his true believers get really upset. They get passionate. And I think a lot of Republicans say, we can't go through the election under these circumstances.
Yeah, it'll work for his rhetoric among his world. See, they're trying to get me. It's the establishment. They fear our revolution together. remember, one of the strongest things you can do if you're a politician looking at legal trouble is become a live candidate, because the justice system hates to touch a live election. They hate to look like they're, remember Comey and Hillary and all the Michigans around that, same deal. But Trump's problems are so big, I don't think it'll save him. I think it's one of the reasons he announced so early to kind of throw up that force field, but it's too much, too late. And it'll help his rhetoric, but it won't widen his appeal. I think it'll actually narrow it.
By the way, announcing early was a big mistake.
Yeah.
It led Merrick Garland to decide to appoint as special counsel someone who is a very tough prosecutor and who says they didn't replace the people who are doing the investigation. He's just leading it now, and he will make the decisions subject to clearing them with Merrick Garland. So I think he thought, if I announce, then they can't do anything to me. And what he did was accelerate the process of investigating him on both the documents at Mar-a-Lago and January 6th and the attempts to overturn the 2020 election.
And I'll predict the next prosecution. So when Trump announced, and I agree with Bob, it was dumb to go that early. He just loaded the Dems up to play the politics on their side better with a special prosecutor. But when he announced, he had a PAC with $100 million in it, which he'd gotten by sucking up all the low dollar donations, hurting the Republican fundraising for candidates because he kept it all from himself. So now that is a super PAC, which can spend money on his behalf. And among his team of dregs, a few are more capable. They all went over to the super PAC for two reasons. One, there's 100 million there and they can pay themselves a lot. And two, it's illegal for them to talk to Trump, so they don't have to deal with him anymore. But the problem is Trump's a control freak. And when somebody finally gets out the cartoon charts and explains to him, yes, your 100 million is over there at God Bless America PAC, but you can't tell them what to do. They have to legally be independent. Trump's going to go crazy. He's going to pick up the phone. He's going to start calling. Why don't I have ads? More ads on Fox. Attack Hannity.
That would be a crime. Actually, that would be a crime.
That's my point. I don't think he's not going to be able to, or tell Keith Schilling or one of his guys to go meet him in a parking garage. So, you know, he's going to be real stupid about that law. And it's a real law. People have gone to jail for this and he won't be able to resist. Remember, Trump's got no money in a campaign account right now. He raised 100 million. He put it over in escrow. He can't talk to it. I doubt he understands all this because he couldn't convert that money to just a campaign. Now he's got to raise it all over again. The secret moles I talked to in the fundraising machine say the response rate, you know, dear donors, send $12, save America, Trump has dropped through the floor post-election. So they're going to have a cash flow crunch. And one thing we know about Trump, other people's money. When he ran, his main thing was in the last day of the campaign, they raided the account to pay him back for his jet fuel bills because he thought he was going to lose. So anyway, keep an eye on that. That's the next Trump legal scandal, I think, because he's not going to be able to avoid grabbing the big cookie and breaking the law, knowing there's 100 million he cannot control that he thinks is his.
Okay, I'm Rick Caruso, and I just spent $105 million trying to become the mayor of Los Angeles. What happened?
Well, what happened is LA is about 13 or 14% Democratic, Republican, excuse me. And I think when Dick Reardon won, it was 25 or 30% Republican. And he got tagged early on as a kind of he'd left the Republican Party, but as basically the Bass campaign and the media to a certain extent did a very good job of tagging him as a fake Democrat, tagged him for having donated to anti-choice candidates. And he ran a very good ad at the end explaining why he had become a Democrat and that and affirming that he was pro-choice. I think that ad should have been foundational, should have been at the beginning of his campaign. But by the time we got to the general, and I thought it was going to be closer than it was, frankly, by the time we got to the general, I think people had just decided that he was too Republican, and the money probably, it helped him become a serious factor in the race, but also probably hurt him in the end.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine. I gave him a lot of free advice during the campaign. I took a look at the race for him 3 years ago, so I'm pretty acquainted with it. And having come home on Thanksgiving to 3 robbers in my house, I sure wish he'd won, as does every cop I talked to in the ensuing madness over this weekend. The biggest problem he has is that the city of LA is pretty radical. Joe Biden didn't win it in the primary late in the process. Bernie Sanders did. When you think LA, people start thinking Santa Monica and the Valley and everything. The city of is a different animal. And it's majority minority, and he's still a rich white guy from Brentwood with a semi-Republican history. So he kind of had a ceiling in the mid-40s that he just couldn't break through, even though he had the issues. People are berserk about the horrible quality of life in LA. But the tribalism kind of helped. The Republican history, and I agree with Bob, he should have told his story of conversion a lot earlier. I thought on every level, the primary campaign was not great, because it may look like a coronation. He should have spent far less money. So when he lost by 6 points, he's the scrappy underdog trying to change the city, not the rich guy who got massively rejected. The expectations narrative was terrible. But LA is a special animal in municipal politics. And the narrative got away from them, and there just weren't enough votes, even though they're dying for a change candidate. I just saw that Karen is keeping all the Garcetti people around for 5 months because, we need change. So is what it is. He's a happy warrior. I talked to him yesterday, and he's doing great. And he's going to stay involved in city issues, which is good.
It looked like he was putting Hispanic votes in play significantly.
Younger Hispanic vote here, though, it's very radicalized. We have 2 Democratic socialists, not like secret meeting, but like, here's my card on the city council. I moderated the debate in Larchmont in that area in the Mitchell-Farrell district. And I asked Hugo, our new councilman-elect, and disclosure, I'm all for Mitch, but you're a SCI hotel employee, labor organizer, career, you've been effective at it. On the city council, how are you going to negotiate? And they go, oh, I'm all for them. He's, to his credit, he's honest about it. So the younger Hispanic, there's a big sliver of the younger Latino vote, which is highly radicalized. And you see it in the local races. And Rick did not get what he needed there. He did great with older Hispanics. He did pretty well in the Valley, and he chipped off a decent chunk of white liberals, but not enough. And the Latino thing underperformed in the end. It was very age connected.
I'd like to speak nationally about Hispanic votes. There's been some suggestion that there's been erosion of Hispanic voting for Democrats in South Texas, for example, and obviously there's a split in Hispanic votes in Florida between Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and others. I always thought that a Republican Party that wasn't beating the drum repeatedly about immigration in the nastiest kind of way could make real progress among Hispanic voters that tend to be a little bit more conservative culturally. What's your view about the 2 parties and how they should approach Hispanic votes?
Well, first of all, there isn't one Hispanic vote.
Right.
There are all sorts of South Florida, or Florida in general, is a very different case with the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the Colombians than, say, Nevada, where Catherine Cortez Masto got reelected because she got overwhelming Latino votes. So different places, different things. The Rio Grande Valley in Texas has always been a Democratic hope and a Democratic disappointment. And that's not necessarily because people turn out and vote Republican, it's because they don't turn out. And Democrats have to pay more attention to getting that turnout moving. But if you look at some other states, Hispanic votes, Latino votes have generally stayed pretty Democratic. There's been some progress by the Republicans, but not huge. That's one of the battlegrounds for the future, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Bob. It's the battleground. I've done a lot in Florida, very different Latino vote there than in Nevada. Texas is highly assimilated. Over time, Latinos are American dreamers who move up and become more assimilated and become more politically and ideologically diverse. They're fairly cultural conservative in most places, though it's very different. The Central American vote, you see a lot of in Florida and even the Northeast. In California and to a lesser extent Texas, but also New Mexico and Arizona, heavily Mexican American, although we have a big and meaningful Salvadoran community in Southern California. If they're still connected a generation or two away from Mexico, the Mexican political system is very left of center, very corporatist, very paternal. The government takes care of you. And so ideologically, it's a farther journey, particularly for Latinos still connected to Mexican experience, to family, to move right here than it is in more assimilated, more multi-generational Texas or in very different Florida. But the trend is pretty good. And the mistake the Democrats keep making, because they can't resist it, because it is the most important idea in their leadership class, not necessarily among their voters. And that disconnect is something Republicans exploit, which is the leadership class, the elites around it, think it's about identity. On the ground, it's about how do I move up in America? How do I get my kid into college? And how do I get a good paying job? When Kamala Harris, I was doing the anti-Trump stuff in a couple of states, Republican voters against Trump. We spent about $20 million to help Biden. We're not the guys who are the crooks who stole all the money. We were the other one. And we spent a bunch of attention in Florida, in a few other key states. And every time they sent Kamala Harris into Dade County, where I've worked a lot to talk identity, us voters of color, it was a disaster, because that's exactly what they didn't want to hear about. They wanted to hear about Venezuela, where there were refugees and a dictator. They wanted to hear about opportunity, small business, all the aspirational issues that the Republicans, when we're on our meds, are pretty good at.
Yeah,
so have a lot to learn.
But Dave, I think you're right. There's a real barrier for Republicans as long as they talk Trump-like about immigration. I think John McCain understood this.
George W. Bush really understood
George W. Bush. George W. Bush and Ted Kennedy had a deal. They just couldn't get enough Republican support to get it done.
By the way, the biggest secret Bush family bet in George W. Bush's elections was who would get a better number in the Latino areas in Miami and around Orlando and parts of Tampa, Jeb or George. They were in that was their biggest competition.
Who won?
Yeah. George did okay, Jeb slated, because Jeb's basically a Latino guy from Miami in many ways.
Who speaks very fluent Spanish.
Believe me, he probably speaks it more by choice than he does English. He's extending. Jeb was the Miami-Dade Republican chairman. He kind of built the party down there years ago. But anyway, that's what because they both got it. And, and George W., not take away from him, he did fantastic in Texas and pretty damn well in Florida. He did a little better. We would have had less drama in the first presidential. But
okay, I'll get you guys out of here on this last one. Dianne Feinstein's up in 2024. What's happening there?
Well, Bob's in charge of talking her out of running again, so he'll do it.
She will not run. Adam Schiff wants to run. I have a suspicion that if Joe Biden is running for re-election, that Gavin Newsom will take a look at running for the Senate seat. And there may be a number of other people, but it's the other question that's quite interesting is what if she would, for example, resign before 2024? Who would the governor appoint? He can't appoint himself. There's a long history. He can, by the way, but there's a long history of governors who appoint themselves to the Senate and they then lose the next election. And even in true blue California, I don't think people would be thrilled with the governor appointing himself to the Senate.
Yeah, there are three horses circling now. Schiff really wants to run, big fundraiser, hiring people. I'd be surprised if he doesn't. Fear that Gavin will jump in and Bigfoot everybody. And Katie Porter is looking at it seriously. So you could have a war for the ages between Porter and Schiff, but that kind of opens it up for a Bay Area candidate. And if you can unite the Bay Area in a Democratic primary, you're a contender. So it's going to be interesting.
No Republican has any shot, Mike?
No, not really. I mean, we could grow one, but the politics here now, I mean, we're Utah, a blue Utah. So you basically have two with our system, which is good, the top two. It's a great reform, almost as good as ranked choice. But you're going to probably have a left to center, labor heavy Democrat and a coalition Democrat who's trying to attack Republicans and independents, but is vulnerable from the left. That's probably where it could wind up. But if they're all the same kind of Democrat, essentially, then it becomes about gender and region. San Francisco Bay versus two LA candidates, female versus the stature of a shift. You know, it's going to be a great primary, I think, exciting.
Okay, guys, really, it was fascinating. Loved it. Thanks so much for coming on board. And we'll always be following you wherever you appear. We appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you. I just want to end with a thanks. I know Bob has one, and a double plug from both of us. Go to the website, USC Center for the Political Future. We have a ton of programming on Zoom. We don't turn down contributions, by the way, but get involved and see all the stuff we pump out. I think if you're interested in politics, there's a lot there for you.
So Mike did the commercial. So I'll just say thank you. And we were thrilled to be here, and it was a lively discussion. And, you know, we come from different ends of the spectrum, but we do believe that it's possible to talk to each other in a respectful way, and in the process to respect the truth.
Appreciate it,
Thank
guys.
you all very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Next month, Thursday, January 19th, we're returning to Skirball, back at Skirball. Our speaker will be Daniel Tressman, a professor of political science at UCLA. Tressman's work focuses on Russian politics, economics, and comparative political economy. He will address the ongoing war between Russia and the Ukraine. When we're returning to Skirball, we need to video those performances. Bill Clarkson, who has done it for us for many years, is handing off on those duties. So if you have the skills and the equipment, step up. Now is your time. Contact either me or Sander in the office, and we'll see you in January. Skirball, coffee and cookies on Play-Doh. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.